You're listening to Black Like Me with Dr. Alex G., a podcast that invites you to experience the world through the perspective of one black man, one conversation, one story, or even one rant at a time. Here's Dr. G.
Hey everyone, I want to welcome you back to another exciting episode of Black Like Me with Dr. Alex G. And I know you hear me say this each episode about how excited I am about a guest, but I'm really excited about today's guest. His name is Reverend Rob Lee IV. He is a collateral, in his word, a collateral descendant. He'll explain that a little bit more, of General Robert E. Lee. And I have enjoyed following him on social media. I feel that he said some very bold and really thought-provoking things. And so we connected up in social media and we went back and forth a little bit. And so he's going to be in the studio today. And as you know, this podcast is really about understanding what it's like to navigate this country, this world as an African-American man. But I also want people to see it through the lens of folks who are allies and not necessarily African-American. So from time to time, we bring people in from different ethnic and cultural backgrounds to talk about some of the great work that they're doing. You know, in the Black Like Me family, we kind of refer to it as working that white and turning access and privilege and power into something that's very useful. And so Reverend Lee is a faculty lecturer at Appalachian State. He's an ordained minister. He's a graduate of Duke Divinity School. He's developed or has been given this great platform to talk about race and monuments and faith and millennials and sacraments and so many things in a real meaningful way. So, Reverend Lee, thank you so much for being a guest on Black Like Me.
Gosh, it's such an honor. Thank you so much. Well,
you just have to know I appreciate your work, as I mentioned when I first reached out to you. So I have a number of things to ask. I just got a whole lot of questions, and so if you're ready, I can just jump right into them.
Yeah, let's get started.
First of all, I just have to say thank you for your ballsiness, because it is not easy to stand up against structured racism. And I grew up in Madison, Wisconsin. It's a community I love, but we're plagued, and I choose that word carefully, with niceness and being politically correct and believing our own hype about being so progressive that sometimes we feel that hashtagging or retweeting something means that we have become an activist. And so when I watched your clip on the VMAs, or I watched your response to some things that Donald Trump said, I realized, man, that you're really putting yourself out there. And I just know as a public figure, it's easier said than done. And then you got to live with the backlash. And I think civil rights leaders of decades ago didn't have to worry about things like social media. So first of all, I want to say, and I want to be careful in saying this, because I know you're not doing this to be congratulated by the black guy with a podcast. But when I'm watching the things that you're doing and that you're saying, I'm touched by the thoughtfulness, the theology, and the sheer practicality that you put into what you say and do. So I just need to start off by just telling you, I really respect you for that.
Well, thank you. And I look at it this way. I had a mentor tell me one time that I'm a lot like a lightning rod as a white person. Mm-hmm. And it's a great honor to be a lightning rod, because you get to take some of the heat so that others don't have to. And I think that's really important to think about in our day and age, is what kind of heat can we take so that other minority communities or other communities that are struggling or under the weight of oppression don't have to face. And sometimes that means confronting our president, or confronting Confederate monuments, or confronting theologies and systems that don't actually liberate but instead oppress. And so that's kind of how I see it, is more of a lightning rod than anything. It is taking that heat so that others don't have to.
Man, that's great. That's great insight. So I just got, again, a number of questions, and so inquiring minds want to know. So I'll just jump in. At what age did you realize the significance of the Lee name?
I think living in the South, it was one of those things that I knew right away from my borning cry that this would be something that I would be dealing with for the rest of my life, because it's so deeply ingrained in our culture down here. That Lee was a celebrated general in the eyes of so many. I can't go to a home improvement store in our community now, because every time I hand my credit card to the person at the cashier's desk, they will say the South will rise again. You can't do that.
Snap.
It is that pernicious down here, or celebrated, depending on how you look at it. So I think I was deeply ingrained in it, and deeply, it was one of those things that I've just always known, but I didn't know the weight of it until Charlottesville.
Wow.
I didn't know the power it could wield until Charleston. I didn't know that there were so many things that were happening that I could use my name for the good instead of for ill, instead of just for being a joke about Uncle Bob, as we call him in our family. And that was one of those things that I think is so important to remember, is that we have the potential to use it for good and not for ill.
Right. That's powerful. That's real powerful. So growing up as a young person, you never thought that this would be part of your work? Did you ever dream that you would be speaking out against some of the actions of Uncle Bob?
Well, gosh, I don't think I always knew that Uncle Bob was problematic. I always knew that Robert E. Lee was problematic, but I never thought that my life's work would be dedicated, at least in this season of life,
right.
To engaging the systems of oppression that are facing the African American community, that are facing communities that have been systemically oppressed for centuries. I did not expect that. I expected to be a pastor of a church and just kind of do that and live into that, but that was not what God intended for me. And I like to think of it in the way that Joseph thought of it in Scripture, when Joseph said, "You intended it for ill, but God intended it for good."
That's right.
I've had a lot of stuff thrown at me lately, but I know deep down that ultimately God is intending this for good. And there is good that can come out of it, and there is hope that can come out of it. I mean, we the fact that you and I are talking is a sign of how far we've come and how far we have to go. It is both here and now and then and there kind of thing, It's a beautiful reality, but it's also a challenge.
Right,
I view it all in that lens and try and think of it that way.
Definitely. I think it's also important for the Black Like Me podcast family, the folks who are listening, to understand that this is not necessarily easy. Just because you made this choice doesn't mean that you have fully overcome every thought or vestige of being privileged and white and male in America. So I'm sure, or to what extent do you have to just check your own heart from time to time, just so people understand a little bit more about your story and that this is not just a slam dunk for you, I would imagine?
Well, I don't see it as a slam dunk. I mean, there are days when it's really frustrating, when it's easy to sink back into my white skin and say, this isn't my fight. I don't have to fight it. And there are days that
I hear that a lot from my friends. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I do hear that a lot when it gets tough.
Yeah, when it gets tough, it's easy to sink back into your skin and just say, this is not my time. And I have to constantly remind myself that there are systems at work, there are powers and principalities at work that seek to undo us. And coming from the mainline Protestant tradition, I didn't always believe that. But I really believe that there are some forces of wickedness out there that are really trying to tell us to sink back into our white skin and to be those people who just say, this is not my problem, not my fight.
Right. And listen, I'm Black and Pentecostal, so I believe in evil spirits. And so you're talking my language. You're talking my language. Hey, let me know. What has been your experience with the Black faith community as you've spoken up? I mean, you became really sort of a national figure. People became more recognized with your name at the VMAs in August of 2017. But I'm curious. What have been some of the reactions that Black clergy or Black congregations or Black Christians in response to things that you're saying?
I had the distinct privilege of preaching from the pulpit of Ebenezer Baptist Church
in Atlanta.
In Atlanta.
Wow.
Yeah, the mother church in Atlanta. A few months back, and that was one of the I would say highlights of all that I've been through. I've been through amazing. A lot,
right?
VMAs, and I've made a lot of great clergy friends who are Black. Jonathan Walton at Harvard, and Bernice King in Atlanta, and Raphael Warnock in Atlanta. And these people have really helped me, given me a place in their pulpits. And that's in their amazing. Spheres of influence to speak up and to speak from my perspective. And I will be forever grateful for that, because ultimately, as you all, as people of color, are leading the way and leading the charge, allies and co-conspirators, as I like to call myself, we're working to make sure that we're checking our own folk too, but we still like to do stuff together. And I think that's really important that we were able to unite on those fronts and work together and preach from the same pulpits and talk about things that matter to us. And in fact, Bernice King, the daughter of Martin Luther King Jr., read the foreword for my next book that's coming out in April.
Oh, that's really fantastic. Another piece of your work that's intriguing to me is that you describe yourself as a public theologian. And I'm the most tenured minister in our city. I've been a senior for 31 years, and then I was the associate for 5 years before that in the same congregation. It used to be a church in my mom's living room. But as I've stretched out to work in more social justice issues, particularly issues of racial righteousness or racial reconciliation, there have been some who've questioned, what are you doing outside the pulpit? You should be inside the four walls, et cetera, et cetera. It's interesting. There's one camp that says stay inside the four walls. There's another camp that says get out. But I like the fact that you've rooted your work not merely as a public rhetorician, but as a public theologian. Is that a concept or a truth that you feel that's a part of your calling that you owned, or did someone sort of, I don't want to say thrust you, did someone sort of name, hey, Reverend Lee, this is what you're doing? Or did you feel like you were told or called to be this public theologian? How did you come into that space and that title?
Well, I think we're all public theologians in some sense of the word. We all do theology in public. Mine just happens to be a little more public than others.
Mm-hmm.
But
Good
I
point.
looked at it this way. Nat Turner was a public theologian. William Sloane Coffin was a public theologian. Martin Luther King Jr. was a public theologian.
Sure.
They were all standing up and offering theologies that were contrary to that of the day. And they were saying, look, this is who we are, and we are not going to apologize for who we are. We are going to fight for who we are, and they did it in very different ways, from opposing the Vietnam War to working for racial reconciliation to revolting against slavery. But they all did it from a pastoral perspective. And I think that's what's so important about public theology. Is it's theology done in public. It's recognizing that theology is done in the public square, but it's done in a pastoral sense as well.
Sure.
By virtue of my ordination to ministry, I am a public theologian. And by virtue of our baptisms, we are all called to ministry.
Sure.
And of one form or another. And so that's how I kind of see it through a sacramental lens, is this is how we are called to do what we do. And ultimately, some of us do it more publicly and some of us do it more privately. But I don't see it as it has to be done within the four walls or outside the four walls. I think the pulpit has had to become inherently political since its inception in the United States. I mean, if you look at some of the earliest sermons in the United States, they were about what was going on in the Revolution.
Of course.
If you look at some of the sermons during the Civil War, in fact, I commend to your listeners The Civil War as Theological Crisis, which is a wonderful read, and it talks about how the North preached from Deuteronomy and the South preached from Deuteronomy. They both preached the same sermons, but they were very different angles. So theology has been done in the public square for a very long time, especially in the United States. And I think it will continue, especially with the rhetoric that we have today.
Sure. Hey, tell us a little bit about your connection to General Robert E. Lee. I heard you say in one of your videos that you're a collateral relative. So does that mean that your great-grandfather was his brother?
Yes, that's correct.
Got you. And do you know much? We don't have to necessarily go into this, but do you know much about sort of the political inclinations of your great-grandfather, and if they were very similar to the generals, or if they differed a bit on those views? On the role of slavery and
one of those families. Yeah. The Lee family was one of those families that has been around since this nation's inception. In fact, two of the Lees signed the Declaration of Independence.
Wow.
Richard Henry Lee was the first president of the Continental Congress. And so the Lees have been around in this nation for a very long time, but they also have a very marred history with slavery. The Lee, one of the common arguments is, well, Lee inherited his slaves. He still enslaved people. We can't get around the fact that happened. And so I think we have to acknowledge what good was done by the Lee family in signing the Declaration of Independence and, being in the Continental Congress. And then you have to also acknowledge the bad that was done by the Lee family, which was working to prop up and continue the state's rights to own slaves.
No, definitely, definitely. That's right. Wow. You said two family members signed the Declaration of Independence.
That's correct.
Wow. That bit of history is really insightful. And then I know as I was just, I'm prepping on your background, okay, there was George Washington, am I getting this right? Curtis Lee or George Washington Lee Curtis? I'm butchering. I'm trying to remember my history. But was he married to a descendant of Martha Washington?
Robert E. Lee married Martha Custis,
that's right.
who was a stepdaughter of George Washington. George Washington didn't have any children of his own, but he did have stepchildren, and one of those stepchildren married Robert E. Lee.
Wow, that's a whole lot of history, brother. That's a lot.
Yeah.
Let's see. So,
and it's interesting because and it also points to the picture of what philosophers have said for a long time, that people, Robert E. Lee and all these characters in our history, even George Washington, are a lot more murky than we like to paint them.
Right.
And I think it's important to remember. Robert E. Lee did awful things. But Robert E. Lee also did a lot for education in Virginia after the war, and tried to help with Reconstruction, and was the first to apply for citizenship. I mean, there's some things that we can say that he did good, and I think that paints a picture that is a little more gray than we like to paint our pictures. And I hope that your listeners will hear me in my humility in saying that, but I think it's a little more murky than we want to paint it.
Sure. There's a lot of national discourse happening around the monuments, and so I can't avoid that, that subject. And I think that that's one of the initial places, at least where I heard of your emergence. And so at the VMAs, which is a very unique place to make this statement, as you introduced Heather Heyer's mother, Mrs. Bro. Am I pronouncing that right, Mrs. Bro? And
yeah, that's correct.
And so, did VMAs invite you? Did someone from your denomination say, "Hey, Rev, this is a good place to go"? How did you end up at the VMAs? And I just got a couple of questions about just being there.
Yeah, well, I did a morning interview with Morning Edition on NPR. And MTV's president listens to NPR.
Oh, got you.
He had his vice president, Newport Argowal, reach out to me and flew my wife and I out to LA, and it was the biggest pulpit I've ever had.
Of course.
5.64 million people that night, and it was a very interesting pulpit. It was an unlikely ministry partner, but it's one I'm grateful for.
I love the boldness that you had, and to call those things out in that kind of setting was fairly amazing. And I'm just curious, when you left the stage, did you have any regrets at that moment? I know there might have been some a little bit later, but from the time you just walked off the stage, did you just think, oh, I don't know if this is a good idea, or this was a great opportunity, I might get crucified behind it, but this is a great opportunity I had to take? Were there any initial regrets?
No, there weren't. And I think of it this way, in spite of it all, there might have been inklings of moments where I was like, maybe not. Sure. But through it all, I've thought to myself of what Mark's gospel says: what good is it to gain the whole world and forfeit your soul?
Right.
Had I not gone on that show that night, I would have forfeited my soul.
Wow. That's an important statement. And tell me some of the upside of appearing on VMAs. Because it's easy to talk about some of the sacrificial pieces, but what conversations has it started? What new doors has it opened? What has it awakened in you? What have been some of the upsides?
I think the awakening in me was that we have a voice as a community of faith that can go beyond the church.
Definitely.
But is also deeply rooted in the church. And that some of my greatest friends that I've loved, I've lost some of them through this because they just didn't want to deal with it. They didn't want to feel like that was, but I've also gained some really incredible friends. So I look at it as it's been refiner's fire kind of stuff, from scripture, in Malachi when he talks about refiner's fire and fuller's soap. That it's been refiner's fire for me, and it's been a journey, but it's been a beautiful one.
Wow, that's really great. I'm looking at one of your quotes, and I think this came perhaps from when you and your congregation parted ways. But you said, and I want to especially challenge white Christians in America to take seriously the deadly legacy of slavery in our country and commit ourselves to follow Jesus into a time of deep reflection, repentance, and reconciliation. Those words hit me because I'm finding that, and I love being a part of the church and a part of a Christian minister who's working to take, my language and my work outside the stained glass windows, outside the four walls. But I find that there's such pushback in some Christian circles that I'm being divisive when I say we've got to talk about these issues and there needs to be a time of deep reflection, repentance, and reconciliation, because only that leads to a real change of hearts and to a real turning. So I'm curious, are you finding that more and more Christians, is it becoming easier, I guess I want to ask, to share this message and watch people respond to it, the need for repentance, deep reflection, and reconciliation?
I don't know if it's getting any easier, because we have some leaders who are not willing to engage with us in those conversations.
Mm-hmm.
But I do know it's a necessary, regardless of how hard or easy it is, it's a necessary conversation. Because if we aren't willing to have this conversation now, more lives will be lost. And I think what scared at least white folks so much, myself included, about Charlottesville was that racism didn't just affect black people that day.
Right.
White supremacy is so pernicious, so dangerous, so scary that it is now affecting even well-intentioned progressive white folk. And that's scary.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
And it's not to deny what's happened in the past. It's just to say that it's so dangerous now that even people like me are losing my jobs at a church, and Heather Heyer's dead.
Right.
There are some real realities there that we have to examine and take account and atone for, along with the countless black lives that have been lost to police brutality, to all the things that have happened from chattel slavery up to Jim Crow to Reconstruction and all those things that failed. We have to atone for that.
Sure.
And if the church is not willing to do that, then the church is not much use at all.
Mm-hmm. Reverend, have you wrestled with the issue or even the question of whether or not America would have responded to the death of an individual at that anti-racism rally if Heather had been African-American? And if I can understand if that's too touchy, you don't want to address it, but I have to say, just in black circles, those are questions that come up, not minimizing what happened to her, but just the sense of how America's become numb to the idea of blacks dying because of senseless racist crime. So I'm curious, have you had discussions around how America responds when black people die in rallies and how it responds when someone white does?
I look at it this way. For me, life is sacred. Mm-hmm. And I think it was really hard, knowing Susan Bro now and getting to know her. She is one of those ladies who believes that Heather would have never wanted this kind of spotlight that she's received.
Sure.
And I am afraid that your inklings may be correct, that we have become numb to the death of precious children of God.
Right.
And that is a grave, grave sin. And to become numb at a moment like this is complicity in racism and in supremacy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No. Yeah, I appreciate that, that response. Let's just go back to monuments again for just a moment, and you might be able to clarify just some of the history of this. But General Robert E. Lee had an interesting background. Like, he was asked to fight for the Union Army, then inherited his in-laws' estate, and then fought for the Confederates. But he did not want to secede from the nation. At least I'm finding quotes where he's just saying this is nothing short of rebellion. So I'm just curious, how does a family not necessarily history books, but how does the family talk about how he may have vacillated on whether he wanted to have slaves freed or not, between whether or not he thought seceding from the nation was a good thing or a bad thing? How does the family, how does the Lee family, your Lee family, process or retell what might seem like wishy-washiness to those of us who are just merely reading Wikipedia or text or online facts?
Well, I can only speak for myself.
Sure.
I know and learned that Lee spent the night before he resigned his commission pacing the floor of Arlington House, trying to figure out if he was going to fight for the Commonwealth of Virginia or to fight for his country, the United States of America. And Lee ultimately chose the wrong decision to fight for the Confederacy and the Commonwealth of Virginia, and to fight for the continued enslavement of black bodies and black people. And that was just really a major faux pas on his part, to put it lightly. So I think the question is a moot point of what he thought. His actions speak far louder than his words.
Right.
Now, I will give Lee credit that Lee, after the war, was very against monuments.
Right. I read that. I was going to ask you about that next.
That's a really interesting thing that a lot of people miss, is that Lee was very against the monuments and the feelings engendered after the war. He thought, well, we fought, we lost, we've got to get over this.
Right. He says right here, I think it was
letters that he wrote.
You're right. I see one like in Lexington, Virginia, on the 5th of August in 1869. I think it wise, moreover, not to keep the open sores of war, but to follow the examples of the other nations who endeavored to obliterate the marks of civil strife, to commit to obliviating the feelings engendered, thereby. Very respectfully, your obedient servant, R.E. Lee. So he was invited to a place where to a place of, I guess you can call it reenactment or celebrating the battle. But he made it very clear: let's not gloat, let's not pour alcohol or whatever you want to call it on open sores. That was a very interesting statement that he made, to have so much controversy around pulling down statues made to him.
Well, I think it contributes again to the murkiness of the character of Robert E. Lee, that we'll never know fully who he was, beyond that of what the history books and the biographers and historians tell us.
That's interesting. Where there's a place where I think you and I have parallel stories. It's different but somewhat similar. We hold a U.S. Black History course here in Madison. It's something that my organization does for white allies to understand how we really got here. Because even though we're considered a very progressive and intelligent community, most whites were not taught the truth about U.S. history nor African-American history. So Reconstruction, the 16 men in the Congress, a lot of the things that happened during Reconstruction, Deconstruction, the Compromise, Jim Crow, people are just stunned that they didn't know this, and they considered themselves really educated individuals. But in preparing for one of the lectures, I don't offer the lecture, but I introduced the professors from the University of Wisconsin. I just went out on Ancestry.com because I know that my great-great-grandfather's name was Henderson G, and he was biracial. And I have an odd name. I've always been asked what it means, but I found out that my great-great-grandfather's dad was his slave owner. And Henderson is my grandfather's grandfather. And his mom, whose name was Venus, was owned and raped by Reuben G. And so I found through Ancestry.com white relatives who were G's, who are descendants of Reuben G. In fact, we found that my great-great-grandfather, Henderson, was the half-brother of some white gentleman on Ancestry.com. His name is John. That John's great-grandfather, my great-great-grandfather, were brothers. And you could see the family resemblance from their nose, cheek structure, hairline. And so we've been talking together. In fact, we have a podcast coming out where we're talking about what it meant to meet each other. I went and found my great-great-grandfather's burial site. It's completely separate from the white G's, but like there's a white laundry mat. There's a G laundry mat, a G grocery store. There's a road that's called the G Road. There's an area that was called G Town. And so I am now in connections with, I've had John in my home. I've been in his home, but we are blood relatives. And so I'm looking at my history and understanding that I can't even lie and say that I'm colorblind, that on some days John and I will talk and I feel like, well, we've beaten history because we're homeowners, our daughters are going to college, we're equals, but I can't ignore the fact that my family was given the Homestead Act in the early 1800s. So they have like 300 years of an equity jump on me. And so I'm going down and I'm meeting with white relatives who are not shocked in Mississippi. They're not saying to me, how could this be? They're saying, now, who's your granddaddy? Who's your great-great-grandfather? There's one woman who runs the G grocery store in Carthage, Mississippi. I showed her the picture of Henderson G. She followed me to my car and she said, can I get a copy of that picture? Because I've seen him before. Because, her grandparents knew that they had a black uncle and her great-grandfather knew that he had a black brother. So it's one thing for me to talk about history and this legacy, this negative legacy of slavery as an African-American male. But to meet and become cordial with and friends with white G's is it's an extremely surreal experience. And so I'm realizing that my family's talk and this lineage is really part of the American story, just like you do from a different perspective. But I'm realizing on one hand, my white colleagues are saying slavery's been over for 150 years. Can't we just move ahead? But, the last time Robert G. and Henderson G. were probably in the same space was in a courtroom over some family death that they're trying to work out. But it took 120 years for their descendants to be in each other's homes. And a lot has happened in 120 years. And so I'm in this place where I'm looking at history and its impact on my family. Again, it's different the way you look back on your family, but I think we're navigating what does it mean to be descendants of something very, very ugly. I mean, people know what the name General E. Lee means, but they've asked me my whole life, what does G mean? But my name comes from my family's rapist and slave owner. And I've worked my entire career to make that a good name. But at the end of the day, I know some of the subplot as well. And so it's very interesting when you start dabbling in and owning your history, because it does have a psychological and an emotional impact on how we navigate the world today. So I'm sure I'm speaking to the choir that you must own that every day.
Well, I look at it this way. I think we live in very different narratives. Not you and I, but like we have to live as a community in different narratives.
Right.
The narrative of our past is certainly important and one that we have to think about. The narrative arc of our past is something that is very important. But as a Christian and as a pastor and as someone who is raised by wonderful parents, I really believe that it's not where we came from, it's where we're going that matters, while recognizing where we came from, recognizing the fact that our past was not what it should be as a collective past, as an individual past, but recognizing that we've got a future too. And if we're not careful, we could ruin that future. So I think it's very important for us to consider our past, but not let our past define our future and our future abilities to reconcile with God and with one another.
Sure. So then what's the civic and the systemic responsibility of today's Christian community? Let me explain what I mean. That you're right. I mean, I'm proof that being the great-great-grandson of a slave does not stop me from having an advanced degree of being a published author. However, I've got to be careful that I don't sound as if I'm saying there's no systemic reality, because, my cousin and I both are homeowners. Our daughters are both college graduated. He and I are, I'm from Wisconsin. He's from Michigan. But the truth is, if I lean too much into that story, Rev, then people will think that I'm saying black people pull up your bootstraps like everyone else. And I totally get that if we were dealing in a true meritocracy. And so I guess what I'm wrestling with, and I want to make sure I'm giving you room just to clarify, that I don't live in that place that I'm the great-great-grandson of a slave, except to think about the strength of my faith and my mother and decisions that my mother made so that I can be who I am today. But there's still pressures that I carry, still glass ceilings that are there, still systemic realities that really impede us to fully function children of God with inalienable rights, because those systemic realities are still there. And so what my story is causing me to do is to realize that history doesn't define me. It propels me, but it does not negate that history is true, because just because I made it doesn't mean that some of those same systemic realities aren't hemming up other people. And so how do you take a look at your history and realize that being a lead does not define the fact that you can become a good person, a white advocate that's doing great work? But there were systems put in place in Arlington, in Alexandria, in places that have perpetuated themselves that still snare the descendants of the slaves that weren't freed. How do you reconcile that? How do we reconcile both and?
I look at it this way. I grew up, my mom and dad both worked. And so around the time I was 1, my mom asked a retired floor nurse by the name of Janie to come watch me. And it was very much like a scene out of The Help, only that was in the 1990s. And Janie wouldn't drink out of the same glasses as me or use the same utensils as me. And this was 1992 and 3, because she was so deeply ingrained in the Jim Crow South that she would never do that. And years later, after I experienced a call to ministry, I wanted to meet Janie and tell her thank you for raising me for 4 years of my life and for being the swift advocate for the sweet hour of prayer that lasted not just an hour in her book. But I remember going to her house and realizing that she had passed the year before and never getting to reconcile with her. But, we're recording this on All Saints Day in the liturgical calendar. And so I think of it this way, we may never fully get to the place that we need to be in terms of our ability to understand each other, but we can hope beyond hope that one day we will, and we can work for that, and we can give everything we have so that there will never be another day where a person like Janie wouldn't be able to drink out of the same glasses as a white person like me. And that's what propels me forward. That's what keeps me working. That's what keeps me going, is the fact that there was a woman who would not drink out of the same glasses as me because she thought she was different from me. And she may have been different by the color of her skin, but her faith and her ability to show me my humanity was what made us alike. And so that was much more important to me as a child. And we could for sure get into that, but I just think that was what made me who I was today, who I am today.
No, definitely.
I see that as the important propellant for all of us, is so that we make it to a day that that will never happen again.
Sure, and that we all understand what that requires too, Reverend Lee. I mean, so you're absolutely right. So I think. So I want to make sure I get her name right. Did you say Janie or Jamie?
Janie, Janie.
Okay, like Janie. So it makes me wonder, how does she raise her children and grandchildren? And how do you pass along that legacy of you can look people in the eye and you can apply for their jobs and you can live next door, you can marry each other. And so part of what I think we're working towards is not merely that she uses the same spoon, but that she feels good managing the same spoon store or the spoon department, or that she can get the same kind of job, because it will look different today than not thinking that you can drink the same spoon, but it would be in thinking, I can't have the same job. I can't have the same kind of ministry. I can't have the same kind of wealth. I can't have the same type of notoriety. And so that's the piece that we've got to continue to move towards, because folks who were shaped by Jim Crow shaped their children, not necessarily to believe the same way, but that had a definite impact. And so I think that's the trickiness of the work, is not as obvious as whether or not we drink out of the same glass, but it's so palpable because there's still folks who don't believe that they have access to the American dream. And so we have to work to make sure that those opportunities exist, not that we're just telling people, hey, go ahead, you can drink out of the same cup or you can use the same flatware.
Exactly.
But we have to really help them to do that in order to just break the impact of things like Jim Crow. And I suppose that's why people are in our line of work, and like Bernice King and, some of the others who are, so many others. I shouldn't just start naming names, but I guess it's why we still preach and do what we're doing, because as you said, we still have some work to do while still believing in the future that we can work together. I love the fact that my cousin John and I can stay in touch, that we've been in each other's homes, and that we hope to continue to meet and connect. There was something very interesting about circling around and realizing that I have these relatives, and they're not just like relatives by marriage, like that Welsh blood runs in me. And so I embody both of those realities in a way that they don't. They don't embody both the black and the white realities of being G. I do. So there's a way I process it and think about it, but I feel like it's preparing me to be a bridge builder, but a person who says we can do better, but a person that also says there's some systemic realities. Let's continue to work against that so that everyone has access to the good that this country can and should offer. It's more than a notion, but it's important work. And that's why I think I'm happy when I meet people like you who are working, not physically alongside me, but figuratively alongside me, and helping us to become better people and being better, to become more exemplary of our faith in our Lord Jesus.
Indeed. Thank you so much for this. This has been a delight.
I have really enjoyed it. Can you tell us websites where people can find out more about your information? We're going to put this in the notes part of our podcast, because I love to promote the work of people who are kind enough to be my guest. And so is there a website that you refer people to if they want to find out more about your work?
Yeah, my website is www.rev, and then ROBLEE.com, RevRobLee.com. I'm on Twitter at Rob Lee IV, and I'm on Facebook if you search for the Reverend Rob Lee, and that should get you there.
Definitely.
And I have a book coming out, which we'll send the link over to you and make sure you have it. It's coming out April 2nd.
Okay, that is really great. And then we will definitely be looking forward to promoting this and just getting your story out there. Again, thank you so much for the work that you do, for taking out time in your evening to do this interview. Best of luck to you and blessings upon you, your work, your ministry, studies, and all the things that you're doing. And kudos to your family, because I know what a sacrifice it is to have a family, particularly a young family, share a family member with the broader community. So thank you for being a part of Black Like Me, and we'll get all of your links, and just hope that you will just help to promote what we're doing and getting this interview out to your friends and your network. So thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.
My guest on this episode was the Reverend Robert Lee IV, a collateral great nephew of the General Robert E. Lee. And so listen, share this podcast, subscribe, let your friends know about it, repost it, because we got some really good information out there. I enjoy talking to this colleague. Hey, and if you want to find out about my blogs and other things that I'm doing, go to alexg.com. There's actually a place where you can subscribe there to follow me more closely, to find out other things that I'm doing when I'm not behind the mic at the Black Like Me podcast studios. So you have a great day, and thank you so much for being a part of Black Like Me.
Thank you for listening to today's podcast. You can find out more about Dr. Alex G's amazing work at www.alexg.com. Black Like Me is sponsored by the generosity of the Human Family Unity Foundation.